was wrong. I'll admit that right now, before I say anything else. I made mistakes raising my daughter, and I own every single one of them. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the morning I opened my email and found an invoice. A formal, itemized invoice from my own daughter for $427,000. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer in Edmonton, Alberta. I worked in the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze before you even locked the front door. I built bridges, overpasses, water treatment infrastructure. I was not a wealthy man by Bay Street standards, but I was comfortable. I had a paid-off house in Glenora, a decent RRSP, and one daughter I would have walked through fire for. Her name is Vivienne, and she just sent me a bill. The email arrived on a Tuesday in February. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my second coffee, watching the magpies fight over a crust of bread someone had left on the back fence. The subject line read, "Final Cost Summary, Business Launch and Grand Opening." I assumed it was spam. I almost deleted it. But something made me open it, and I sat there for a long time staring at the screen until my coffee went cold. The invoice was real. It had her name on it. It had my name on it. It was broken down into categories: venue deposit, catering, interior renovation, marketing and branding, website development, staff recruitment costs, and at the bottom, a line that simply read, consultant fees, strategic direction, for $45,000. That last one was her fiancé's contribution to the document, I later find out. Let me back up, because to understand why this hit me the way it did, you need to understand what the last 4 years looked like. When Vivienne told me she wanted to open a wellness studio, yoga, nutrition coaching, that kind of thing, I was supportive. Genuinely. She'd worked in fitness her whole adult life, she was passionate about it, and she had a real gift for connecting with people. Her mother, my ex-wife, thought it was a phase. I thought it was a calling, so I backed her. I gave her the first $50,000 as what I called a father's investment. No paperwork, no interest. Just a handshake and a hug and her saying, "Dad, I'm going to make you proud." I believed her completely. Then came the commercial lease in Oliver, one of Edmonton's trendiest neighborhoods. She needed a co-signer because she didn't have enough credit history. I co-signed. The rent was $4,200 a month. Then she needed the space renovated, exposed brick, high ceilings, the works, another $60,000. I dipped into savings I'd been building since she was in diapers, then equipment, reformer machines, sound systems, a commercial-grade air purification setup she said clients expected these days. I wired money in 3 separate transfers. By the time the studio was 6 months from opening, I had contributed, in total, just under $210,000. I told myself it was worth it. I told myself this was my legacy. Not a bridge in some industrial corridor, but my daughter standing in her own space, doing something she loved. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to look at, was that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being her father and become her bank. His name was Renfield. She'd been with him for 2 years when they got engaged. He was 38, had a background in brand consulting, which as far as I could tell meant he made decks in PowerPoint and sent invoices for ideas he'd had over brunch. The first time I met him, he shook my hand too firmly and told me he had a real vision for what Vivienne's business could become. I smiled and passed the buns. He moved into Vivienne's condo, the condo I was partially covering through a monthly loan I had long since stopped expecting back, and within 3 months, he was CC'd on every email she sent me about the studio. Then he started being the one sending the emails. I told myself Vivienne was just busy. I raised her loan after her mother and I separated when she was 11. I coached her soccer team, drove her to dance recitals in 2 feet of snow, sat outside emergency rooms at 2 in the morning when she had a bad allergic reaction at a school trip. I was there, always. So when she started pulling away in small ways, shorter calls, postponed visits, texts instead of conversations, I assumed it was just the pressure of launching a business. I gave her space. That's what you do when you love someone. You give them room to breathe. What I didn't realize was that I'd given her so much room she'd started treating me like a landlord. She only called when the pipes burst. The grand opening was scheduled for March 15th. I found out about it from a mutual friend who'd seen it on Instagram. Vivian hadn't mentioned it to me in weeks, and when I texted to ask about it, she sent back a voice note. Not even a call, a voice note, saying things were really hectic and she'd loop me in soon. I drove past the studio on a Saturday afternoon. There were craft paper rolls on the windows and a printed sign that said, "Opening soon, spring." It looked beautiful, honestly. I stood on the sidewalk in my parka, and I felt this quiet pride that I'm a little embarrassed to describe. I thought, I helped build that. I sent her a text saying I was proud of her. She replied with a heart emoji. 2 weeks before the opening, Renfield called me directly for the first time. He was smooth about it, started with pleasantries, asked how the retirement was treating me, mentioned that Edmonton winters must be tough on someone my age. Then he got to it. The opening was going to be bigger than planned. There was an opportunity to make a real impression in the market. They needed additional funds to cover the gap. How much of a gap? I asked. Around 70,000, he said, give or take. I told him I'd need to think about it. He said, of course, just don't think too long, deposits are due. I called Vivian afterward. She confirmed it, though she sounded uncomfortable, rushed, almost scripted. She said it was a one-time thing, and that once the studio was cash flow positive in 6 months, she'd start paying me back everything. I asked if we could sit down together, just the two of us, and go through the numbers. She said she was too busy right now. She'd call me after the opening. I said okay. That was the last real conversation I had with my daughter for a long time. The invitation to the grand opening never came. I found out on the 10th of March, 5 days before, via a text from Renfield. Not Vivian, Renfield. It said, hey, just a heads up. The launch event is going to be invite-only for press and industry contacts. We think it's best if family comes to the soft opening next month instead. Hope you understand. I read that message 4 times. Then I put my phone face down on the table and sat with it for a while. My daughter was opening the studio I had funded, almost entirely, and I was being redirected to the soft opening, like a general contractor, like someone they'd deal with after the cameras had gone. I called her. It went to voicemail. I texted, nothing for 6 hours. Then, Dad, it's not personal. It's just how these things work. Renfield knows the industry. Please don't make this a big deal. Don't make this a big deal. I'm 63 years old, and I have never in my life felt so small inside my own body. And then, 3 days later, the invoice arrived. I read it again after that first shock wore off. $427,000. They had included everything, and not just what I'd already given. They had included the remaining projected costs as though I had already agreed to them. The consultant fees line, $45,000, had a note attached, covers strategic direction, brand positioning, and launch event management, Renfield Advertising Group. He had invoiced me through my own daughter. I sat at that kitchen table for 2 full days. I barely ate. I watched the magpies. I thought about the $50,000 check I'd written her 3 years ago, and the way she'd hugged me so tight in this same kitchen that I could feel her whole body shaking with excitement. I thought about driving a moving truck to her first apartment in the middle of a July heat warning because she couldn't afford movers. I thought about every hockey game I sat through when she was 12, the ones in rinks so cold you could see your breath, and the way she'd look up at the stands to find me every time she scored. I thought about all of it. And then I called my accountant. And then I called a lawyer. My accountant, a man I'd trusted for 20 years, went over everything I'd sent and confirmed what I already suspected. I had no written loan agreement for any of it. What I had given Vivian was, in legal terms, likely considered gift money. The co-signed lease was the only document with my name formally attached. As for the invoice, it had 0 legal standing. It was a request dressed up in professional formatting. I could ignore it entirely. My lawyer said much the same. She also said something else that I've thought about every day since. The question isn't what you owe legally. The question is what you're willing to accept as the terms of this relationship going forward. What was I willing to accept? I thought about that for a week. In the meantime, I started doing what I probably should have done 2 years earlier. I paid attention. I looked at the studio's social media. I looked at Renfield's LinkedIn, his company's supposed client list, the testimonials that didn't quite read like real testimonials. I asked around quietly. A colleague of mine in commercial real estate knew the building manager for the Oliver property. He made a casual call. What I learned was not good. The renovations had gone significantly over budget, and not all of the overrun had been communicated to me, because not all of it had been spent on the studio. There were receipts, apparently, for furniture that had ended up in Vivienne and Renfield's condo. The staff recruitment costs on the invoice included a salary for Renfield himself for the previous 6 months, backdated. And the marketing budget I'd partially funded, most of it had gone to an agency run by a friend of Renfield's, at rates that a proper tender process would never have approved. I wasn't just being excluded from my daughter's success. I was being invoiced for her fiancé's lifestyle. I did something that took every ounce of restraint I had. I said nothing, not to Vivienne, not to Renfield, not to anyone in the family. I just quietly stopped. I cancelled the pre-authorized transfer I'd set up to cover her monthly expenses, the one she'd been drawing on for 2 years that I'd told myself was temporary. I didn't cancel it dramatically. I just let the next scheduled transfer not happen. 3 days later, Vivienne called. It was the first time in 6 weeks she'd called me without a text first. Her voice had an edge. I recognized, not anger exactly, but that controlled tension that always meant she was trying to keep a lid on something. "Dad, there was a problem with the transfer." "I know," I said. "I stopped it." Silence. "What do you mean you stopped it?" "I mean I've been thinking," I said, "about what kind of father I've been, and what kind of father I want to be from here on out." She said Renfield had told her I was probably just confused about the banking. I told her I was not confused. She said the opening was in 9 days, and they had commitments. I told her I understood. She asked me what I wanted, what exactly I was trying to accomplish, and I said, "I'd like to sit down with you. Just you. No Renfield. And I'd like to have an honest conversation about the last 4 years. She didn't agree. She said she'd talk to Renfield first. I told her that was fine, and that I'd be here when she was ready. She wasn't ready for 11 days. During those 11 days, the grand opening happened without me. I know because I saw it on Instagram. The posts Renfield tagged from the event, the string lights, the little charcuterie boards, the local wellness influencers in matching athleisure. Vivienne looked beautiful. She was smiling in a way that made my chest ache. I don't know if the smile was real or performed. I didn't know anymore which one I was looking at when I looked at photos of my own daughter. I also, during those 11 days, had coffee with a woman named Sandra, the sister of an old colleague who had been through something remarkably similar with her son 6 years ago. She sat across from me in a Tim Hortons on Jasper Avenue and said, "At some point, you have to decide whether the relationship you're fighting to keep is the one that actually exists or the one you remember." I didn't say anything back, but I thought about it all the way home. Vivienne came to the house on a Saturday morning. Without Renfield, I noticed that immediately. She came in, took off her boots at the door. A small thing, but it was the kind of small thing she'd always done. The kind of thing that reminded me she was still my daughter underneath everything. And she sat at the kitchen table, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. I had a folder on the table, not to be dramatic, but I'd put together the numbers. Everything I contributed, dated and itemized, going back 41 months. I'd also printed out 3 things. A screenshot of Renfield's company website, which listed him as currently unavailable for new clients, with a last updated date that overlapped perfectly with when he'd started involving himself in Vivienne's finances. A screenshot from the property management company showing the furniture discrepancy, and the invoice itself with the consultant fees line highlighted. I pushed the folder across the table. She opened it. She went quiet for a long time. "I didn't know about the furniture," she finally said. I know, I said. I believe you. The salary. He told you it was an arrangement you'd agreed to. She nodded. Her eyes were full. Here is where I want to be careful, because I know that in stories like this, it's easy to make the villain a cartoon and the hero a saint, and real life doesn't work that way. Vivian had made choices. She had let Renfield insert himself. She had sent me a voice note instead of calling. She had not invited me to the opening of something I had given a significant portion of my retirement to fund. Those were her choices, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she was also my daughter, and she was sitting across from me looking like she hadn't slept properly in weeks, and something in her eyes told me she'd already started to understand, even before this conversation, that something had gone very wrong. So I didn't lecture her. I didn't make her sit through a rehearsed speech. I just told her the truth. I was not going to pay the invoice. I was not going to transfer any more money through any channel that Renfield had access to or influence over. And I was going to formally withdraw as co-signer on the commercial lease, which my lawyer had told me was possible with 60 days' notice, and which would require her to find a replacement guarantor or renegotiate her lease directly. I also told her something else. I told her that I loved her, that I had always loved her, and that love, real love, not the kind that functions as a line of credit, doesn't come with invoices. I told her I wasn't disappearing. I was just refusing to disappear into the role they had written for me. She cried. I'm not going to pretend she didn't, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't undo me. I sat across from my daughter while she cried at my kitchen table, and I kept my hands flat on the wood, and I did not reach for the checkbook. That was the hardest thing I have ever done. She left 2 hours later. She hadn't defended Renfield. She hadn't argued about the money. She'd asked me, very quietly near the end, if I thought she'd made a mistake. And I told her the truth. Yes, I did. And I also told her that mistakes weren't the same as failure, and that the question was what she did next. What happened next came in pieces. Renfield's response, when Vivian apparently told him I wasn't paying, was to send a follow-up email suggesting we take the matter to mediation. I forwarded it to my lawyer, who responded on my behalf with a letter outlining the complete absence of any enforceable agreement and a formal notice of my withdrawal from the lease co-signing. We didn't hear back. What Vivian did next, she did on her own. She went back to the property manager and renegotiated her lease by removing Renfield from any informal advisory role over the business accounts and replacing the studio's single signatory banking setup, which had been under his name since month 2, with a proper business account in her name only. She told me this in a text about 3 weeks after our conversation. It was the first text she'd sent me that didn't feel like a report card. Renfield lasted another 6 weeks. He didn't leave dramatically. He just started being away a lot. And then one day Vivian texted me to say he had moved out and she wasn't going to talk about it. And I texted back that I understood and that I was here whenever she wanted. She called that Sunday. We talked for 2 hours. She asked me things she hadn't asked in years. How I was sleeping, whether I was keeping up with the old neighbors on the street, whether my knee was still giving me trouble in the cold. She asked if we could have dinner the following weekend. I said yes. The studio is still open. I walked past it last month. The craft paper is long gone, and there's a sign in the window with her name on it. Just her name, clean and simple, and a hand-lettered menu of classes. And I stood on that same stretch of sidewalk in Oliver, and I felt that same quiet pride, except this time it was different. Cleaner, somehow, because this time I was proud of something that had nothing to do with money. I'm not going to tell you everything worked out perfectly. My savings took a hit. I'll be managing carefully for the rest of my retirement. There's a version of the future I'd planned for that no longer exists, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't matter. Some nights I lie awake and think about what I would have done differently. I would have asked more questions earlier. I would have insisted on paperwork, not because I didn't trust her, but because paperwork protects the relationship as much as it protects the money. I would have trusted the small discomforts. The voice notes instead of calls, the emails from him instead of her. and named them out loud instead of filing them away under, "She's just busy." But I also know this. The dinner we had last weekend, just the two of us at a Ukrainian restaurant on 124th Street. The kind of place with pierogies the size of your fist, and the owner who still comes out to ask if everything's all right. That dinner was more real than anything I bought with any of those transfers. She laughed at a story I told about a site visit that went sideways back in 2009. She asked about my plans for the spring. She reached across and touched my hand when I mentioned I'd been thinking about her mother lately. She was my daughter again. She'd been there all along, I think. She'd just gotten a little lost. And me, I'd gotten a little lost too. I'd confused paying for things with taking care of someone. I'd confused availability with love. I'd been so determined to make things easy for her that I'd made it easy for someone else to take advantage of both of us. That's the pot I carry, not with bitterness, just with clarity. You cannot invoice a father's love, but you also cannot forge a relationship out of checks alone. What my daughter and I have now, what we're building back, slowly, Sunday by Sunday, that's something no one can put a number on. And that, in the end, is what I was working for all along. There's a moment I keep coming back to, sitting at my kitchen table, watching those magpies fight over a crust of bread, the invoice open on my screen. $427,000. From my own daughter. And what I felt underneath the shock wasn't rage, it was recognition. I had helped build the conditions that made that invoice possible, one quiet compromise at a time. That's the part nobody wants to sit with. It's easier to cast yourself as the victim and move on. But I'd spent 41 months telling myself that paying for things was the same as showing up, that writing checks was an act of love, that staying silent about small discomforts, the voice notes instead of calls, the emails from Renfield instead of Vivienne, was patience rather than avoidance. None of those were true, they were shortcuts. And shortcuts have a way of compounding interest. What I understand now is that integrity, real integrity, not the kind you talk about, but the kind you practice in the moments nobody's watching, isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small ones. It's about asking for a conversation instead of sending a transfer. It's about naming what's wrong when you first notice it, not 11 months later when the damage has already settled into the foundation. Vivienne didn't lose her moral compass all at once. She drifted, gradually, because I kept smoothing the path instead of asking her to find her footing. And Renfield, he didn't manufacture that situation from nothing. He walked into a dynamic that had already been established, a father who funded without questioning, a daughter who'd learned that love arrived in her account on the first of the month. He just formalized what was already there and put his name on it. The thing that saved us, the thing I'm most grateful for, was that Vivienne still had enough clarity left in her to sit down at that table without him. That took something. It took the kind of honesty with yourself that is genuinely hard to come by when you're in the middle of a life you've built around someone else's version of your future. She could have defended him. She could have walked out. She didn't. She opened the folder, and she sat with what she found in it. That required more courage than I gave her credit for at the time. What I learned, slowly, unglamorously, is that you cannot sustain a relationship on one person's willingness to absorb consequences indefinitely. At some point, the person being protected stops developing the strength to protect themselves. I thought I was giving Vivienne a head start. I was giving her a dependency. The difference between those two things is everything. She runs her studio on her own terms now. Not perfectly. No new business runs perfectly. But honestly, her name is on the door and the account and the decisions. That's what I was working toward all along, even when I was going about it completely wrong. I'm not a cautionary tale, and neither is she. We're just two people who had to get lost before we could figure out the right direction. And the right direction, it turns out, doesn't require a check. It just requires showing up. Actually showing up and telling the truth.